What if you could calculate the exact day you would die? Not guess it, not feel it in your bones, not fear it in the dark, but actually calculate it, like a mathematical equation, like a proof, written out line by line, ending in a single number. In the year 1754, an old man in London believed he had done exactly that. He wasn't a mystic. He wasn't a fortune teller. He was one of the greatest mathematicians who ever lived, the man who helped invent the very mathematics that insurance companies, banks, and scientists still use today. And in his final months, he turned that same mathematics on himself. This is the story of Abraham de Moivre, the man who calculated his own death. And according to the legend that has survived him for over 250 years, he was right. But to understand how a man could ever arrive at a number like that, we have to go back, long before the calculation, long before London. We have to understand how he lived. Because nothing about de Moivre's life was simple or safe. He was born in 1667 in a small town in France called Vitry-le-François. His father was a surgeon, not wealthy, but steady, and his family were Protestants in Catholic France, at a time when that single fact could destroy everything. For years, de Moivre studied quietly, logic, Greek, the beginnings of mathematics, a boy who found order in a world that, for people like him, offered none. But in 1685, everything changed. The French king revoked a law that had protected Protestants for nearly a century. Suddenly, people like de Moivre's family were no longer just a religious minority. They were enemies of the state. De Moivre was imprisoned. Not for a crime, not for violence, simply for what he believed. We don't know exactly how long he was held. Some records suggest months, others suggest longer. But when he finally walked free, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He left France forever and crossed into a country where he knew almost no one. England, a young man with no fortune and no protector, was about to build one of the greatest minds in Europe from nothing at all. Imagine arriving in a foreign country with nothing, no fortune, no formal position, no guarantees, just a sharp mind and a hunger to understand the world through numbers. De Moivre settled in London, and to survive, he became a private tutor, walking from house to house, teaching mathematics to the children of wealthy families. But in his pocket, he carried something extraordinary. Pages torn from a book, Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, one of the most difficult scientific works ever written. De Moivre couldn't afford his own copy, so he tore the pages out, one by one, and read them while walking between his students. Slowly, obsessively, he taught himself what almost no one else in Europe understood. And it worked. He became close with Newton himself. Close enough that in his later years, Newton would refer mathematical questions to other scholars by saying, "Go to Mr. de Moivre. He knows these things better than I do." Think about that for a moment. The man considered the greatest scientific mind in history was sending people to Abraham de Moivre for answers. And yet, despite this, despite his brilliance, de Moivre never received what should have been his. He applied for university positions again and again. He was rejected again and again. Some historians believe it was politics. Others believe it was simply because he was a foreigner. Either way, the man who helped build the mathematical foundations of the modern world spent his entire life as an outsider, tutoring children, solving gambling problems for wealthy patrons in coffee houses, never given the position, the title, the security that his mind had clearly earned. It's a quiet kind of injustice, the kind that doesn't make headlines, but it's also the reason his mind turned, again and again, toward one particular subject, the one thing that had never treated him fairly: chance. But here is what makes de Moivre's story remarkable. He didn't just survive on the margins of academia, he revolutionized an entire field. While other mathematicians studied geometry or physics, de Moivre became obsessed with something different: chance, uncertainty, the mathematics of not knowing what happens next. In 1718, he published a book that would change science forever: The Doctrine of Chances. It was one of the very first complete works ever written on probability theory. Inside it, de Moivre laid the groundwork for ideas that are still used today: the normal distribution, the bell curve you've seen in statistics classes, the mathematics behind insurance policies and life annuities, even the early foundations of what we now call the central limit theorem, a concept so fundamental that without it, modern statistics, data science, even artificial intelligence would not exist in their current form. De Moivre had built a mathematical language for uncertainty itself. He could calculate the odds of nearly anything: dice games, gambling outcomes, life expectancy. He became, in many ways, the most knowledgeable man in Europe on the subject of chance, which makes what happened next almost impossible to believe, because a man who had spent his whole... To understand the final chapter of de Moivre's life, you need to understand who he had become as a person, because de Moivre wasn't simply a mathematician by profession. He was a mathematician in every part of his daily existence. Those who knew him described a man obsessed with precision. He didn't simply sleep when he was tired. He scheduled it, exactly 7 hours, every single night. Not 6 hours and 50 minutes, not 7 hours and 10. 7. Precisely. This was a man who didn't just calculate numbers, he lived inside them. So when, in his 87th year, he began to notice something changing, he didn't dismiss it as simply growing old. He measured it. And what he measured would set the countdown in motion. It started small. De Moivre noticed he was sleeping, slightly longer than usual, not by hours, by minutes, 15 minutes more, each night. To most people, this would mean nothing, simply the body slowing down with age. But de Moivre was not most people. He was the man who had spent his entire life turning uncertainty into numbers, and so he began to track it. Night after night, 15 more minutes, and then 15 more. An arithmetic progression, growing night by night in perfect mathematical rhythm. And then He did something almost no one else would think to do. He calculated where this pattern would lead if his sleep kept extending by 15 minutes every night. How long? Until he was sleeping for 24 hours straight, a full day, without waking. He worked through the numbers, and he arrived at an answer. 93 days. In exactly 93 days. If the pattern held, his sleep would reach 24 hours. And he believed that on that day, he would not wake up at all. Most people, faced with a thought like this, would keep it to themselves, a private fear, perhaps even something to be ashamed of. But de Moivre did the opposite. He told people, openly, calmly, as though presenting a mathematical proof. And one of the people he told was Edmund Halley, the astronomer, the man the famous comet is named after, one of de Moivre's oldest and closest friends in London. Imagine being told by your closest friend that he has calculated with mathematical precision the day of his own death. Would you believe him? Would you dismiss it as the fear of an old man? Or would some part of you start counting the days as well? We don't know exactly how Halley responded in that moment, but we do know this. He didn't walk away. He stayed close to his friend through the months that followed, and in the end, he would become something far more significant than a skeptical friend. He would become a witness. The prediction was made at the end of August 1754. From that point forward, de Moivre's days became a quiet countdown. We don't know if he spent those final months in fear or in a strange, mathematical peace. A man who had devoted his entire life to chance and uncertainty, now facing the most personal uncertainty of all, and somehow believing he had already solved it. His health by this point had already begun to decline. Historical records describe his final years as marked by failing sight and failing hearing, and yet his mind remained sharp until nearly the very end. In fact, just months before his death, he experienced one final moment of recognition. He was elected as a foreign associate of the Paris Academy of Sciences, the very academic world that had rejected him for most of his life, finally acknowledging him, almost too late. The countdown was almost over, and the world was only just beginning to notice him. Day by day, the 15 minutes kept adding up, just as he had calculated. And then, the day arrived, November 27th, 1754, 93 days, almost to the calculation, since he had first shared his prediction. Abraham de Moivre died that day, in London, at the age of 87. His body was laid to rest at St. Martin-in-the-Fields. The man who had spent his life turning chaos into mathematics had, according to those who witnessed it, predicted the very day of his own death, and been right. Now, here is where the story becomes more complicated, because historians do not fully agree on what actually happened. Some accounts, written shortly after his death, describe the calculation in exact detail. Others note that there is no surviving document from de Moivre himself, written at the time, explicitly laying out this calculation. The story may have grown, the way legends often do, passed from person to person, polished, perhaps exaggerated. It's entirely possible that de Moivre simply sensed his body was failing, as any elderly man might, and applied the language he knew best, mathematics, to describe what he was already feeling. Was it truly a precise calculation, or was it an old, brilliant mind finding comfort in numbers as everything else began to fade? We may never know for certain, but maybe that uncertainty is exactly the point. Whether the calculation was exact or symbolic, one thing about this story remains undeniably true. Abraham de Moivre spent his life building the mathematics of probability, the tools that let us calculate the odds of nearly anything. Insurance companies still use principles he pioneered to calculate how long people are likely to live. Statisticians still rely on the bell curve he helped formalize. And in his final months, he turned that same lifetime of mathematical thinking toward the most human and most uncertain question of all, his own mortality. A man who had given the world a language for chance used that very language to make peace with his own ending. Today, almost no one outside of mathematics knows the name Abraham de Moivre. He has no statue in a famous square, no blockbuster film, no widely known legacy outside academic circles. And yet, nearly every modern field that depends on probability, insurance, statistics, finance, even artificial intelligence, stands in some small way on foundations he built. A refugee, an outsider, a man denied the recognition he deserved for most of his life, who, in the end, may have done something almost no one else in history has done: calculated and accepted the exact moment his own story would end. Thank you for joining me on this story, and until next time, stay curious.